The Paraguayan War, also known as the War of the Triple Alliance, was the bloodiest conflict in the history of Latin America. Paraguay lies at the heart of South America, meaning that its position was strategically alluring to the surrounding countries, and that it needed access to river trade routes that connected to the Atlantic. As Latin America emerged as post-colonial nations, the effects of the Paraguayan War shaped the geopolitical landscape of the continent. Join us as we explore the bloodiest conflict in South America's history. In the 1800s, Latin America went from being under Portuguese and Spanish colonial control to gaining its independence. The break for autonomy came after the American-born children of Spanish immigrants wanted greater free trade than their colonial rulers would allow. Adding to this was theories of the Enlightenment, in which people were developing new ideas about basic human rights, controlling governmental power, and reassessing what it meant to be human. During the Wars of Independence, which raged from 1808 to 1826, Latin America fought their way to independence, forming autonomous governments and revolting against Spanish and Portuguese rule. By 1826, all of Latin America, aside from Cuba and Puerto Rico, was independent. Latin America was split into over a dozen separate nations, and only Brazil was able to keep its territory intact. The newly emerging countries faced the challenges of agreeing on boundaries, as well as defining their new states. By 1850, the new nations had begun to define themselves successfully. However, border disputes were still common, and the larger and more powerful countries of Argentina and Brazil tried to consolidate their power by annexing smaller nations. Caught in the sights of these powerhouses were Paraguay and Uruguay, with Uruguay being annexed by Brazil until 1825, and only becoming independent in 1828 after a 3-year federation with Argentina. Paraguay had been involved in boundary disputes with both Argentina and Brazil for years. It had only been recognized as a sovereignty by Argentina in 1852, after the fall of the Argentinian dictator Juan Manuel de Rosas. Throughout the 1850s, the Paraguayan leader Carlos Antonio Lopez attempted to modernize Paraguay. Because of the ongoing border disputes, Lopez was convinced that modernization should be primarily concerned with building up the country's military capabilities. Various other incidents, including the capture of the Paraguayan flagship by the British, fueled his desire to strengthen the military. By the time he died in 1862, he had amassed a considerable force. Despite having put most of his country's energy and resources into military expansion, Lopez was a cautious man. He advised his eldest son and successor, Francisco Solano Lopez, that he should settle disputes through diplomacy rather than force, using the army as a deterrent rather than a threat. Francisco Solano Lopez had himself served in the Paraguayan army from a young age and had fought against Argentina in the sporadic conflicts that erupted between the two countries. The younger Lopez had also traveled extensively in his role as a diplomatic ambassador, buying military supplies and learning European military tactics. However, Solano Lopez was not an elected official as his father had been, and was instead the spoiled son of the former dictator. He had grown up seeing his father putting time and energy into the Paraguayan military, and he wanted to use it to his advantage. Solano Lopez felt that Paraguay should have a larger voice when it came to regional concerns. So, when Brazil threatened to intervene in the civil war that had erupted in Uruguay, Solano Lopez became increasingly belligerent. Ignoring Lopez's threats, Brazil helped the leader of Uruguay's Colorado Party win an election in 1864, leading Lopez to believe that the situation threatened the balance of power in the region. Lopez's fears weren't totally unfounded, and Brazil had essentially invaded Uruguay to overthrow the Uruguayan government in order to install a pro-Brazilian regime. They claimed that this was essential to protect the Brazilian citizens living in Uruguay. In response to Brazil's role in establishing the Colorado Party, Solano Lopez ignored his late father's advice and took Paraguay to war with Brazil. In November 1864, he ordered army and naval units to invade the Mato Grosso Plateau in the north. He started preparing a large army corps to move south in order to meet the Brazilian army in Uruguay. The Paraguayan army then marched on Uruguay in order to push Brazil out. The route took them through Argentina, which denied them permission to cross their borders, prompting Lopez to declare war on Argentina. The Argentine president, Bartolomé Mitre, saw this as an opportunity to settle its border disputes with Paraguay and organized an alliance between Brazil and the Brazilian puppet government in Uruguay. The Triple Alliance then declared war on Paraguay on May 1, 1865. Lopez had overestimated the might of his army and had not accounted for the combined forces of the Triple Alliance that soon outnumbered his troops by 10 to 1. The first major land battle was the Battle of Yatay, in which Paraguayan forces fought valiantly but were eventually overwhelmed by sheer numbers. After the battle, 1,700 Paraguayans were dead, with around 300 wounded and 1,200 taken as prisoners. Amongst the prisoners were soldiers from the ousted Uruguayan Blanco Party, who had fled to Paraguay. When they were discovered, they were immediately executed as traitors. Those who escaped were forced to retreat to Paraguay. The Paraguayan troops who had headed for Uruguay had captured the municipality of Uruguayana on August 5, 1865. Although they had met with little resistance, when news of the defeat of Yatay reached them, they attempted to fortify Uruguayana. Still, by September, they were surrounded by the forces of the Triple Alliance. Land and naval defeats meant that there was little hope that the besieged Paraguayans would be relieved by reinforcements or renewed supplies. On September 4th, the Allies called for the Paraguayans to surrender Uruguayana, but the Paraguayan forces continued to hold out against the 17,346-strong combined forces of the Triple Alliance. However, soon food began to run out, and despite orders by Lopez to continue to fight, the Paraguayan commander, Colonel Estigarribia, was forced to surrender. The surviving Paraguayan forces continued to fall back to Paraguay. The war was no longer about asserting Paraguayan influence, and now Lopez's prime concern was defending Paraguay from the inevitable onslaught. By January 1866, the Allied forces had blockaded all the rivers leading to Paraguay. In April, the Allied troops invaded the southwest of Paraguay, but were unable to get further than Humaita. In May, Lopez desperately sent elite soldiers to their deaths in suicide attacks at Tuyuti, causing him to lose nearly 20,000 experienced and valuable men. The Paraguayans won a battle in September 1866 at Cotopaxi and continued to withstand the invading Allies despite both sides suffering heavy losses. From 1866 to 1868, the fighting continued, but the Paraguayans also had to contend with other threats, as widespread epidemics of Asiatic cholera swept through the country, devastating the already dwindling population. In 1868, Bartolomé Mitre was replaced as president of Argentina by Domingo Sarmiento and as the leader of the Allied forces by Brazilian Luis Alves de Lima y Silva, Marquis of Caxias. Tensions between the progressives and the conservatives in Argentina had come to a head, leading to a political crisis as the Paraguayan War raged on. In February of 1868, the Triple Alliance finally breached the Paraguayan defenses at Humaita, and by the end of 1868, the Paraguayan forces had been decimated. Lopez and his surviving troops fled inland and continued to fight using guerrilla tactics. The Allies pursued him, and the ongoing fighting left a path of destruction throughout Paraguay. The army was shattered, and Paraguayan civilians suffered from famine and disease as they became refugees in their own country. Seeing that his army was mentally and physically defeated, Lopez became increasingly paranoid. He began to suspect that his supporters were conspiring against him, so he started arresting and executing anyone he suspected had turned against him. No one was safe, including his own brothers, his brothers-in-law, ministers, military officials, and religious leaders. Hundreds of men were executed in the San Fernando Massacre of 1868. Lopez is also said to have had his mother, who was 70 at the time, flogged and executed as she had revealed to him that he had been born out of wedlock. In January of 1869, the Allied troops reached the Paraguayan capital of Asunción and forced Lopez and the few that remained loyal to him to flee into the countryside. By February 1870, the diminished force made camp at Cerro Cora. Here, Lopez and his remaining officers decided that they would make their last offensive. On March 1st, the Brazilian cavalry descended on the camp. Many abandoned Lopez, who died in combat after refusing to surrender. By the time the war was over, around two-thirds of the population of Paraguay was dead. The Brazilian army occupied the area, adding further destruction to the country. Paraguay then had to begin the slow and painful process of reconstruction, and the people who had been fanatically devoted to Lopez and the war effort now had to struggle with the disillusionment of their former leader and the machinations of their enemies, as well as malnutrition and disease. Argentina and Brazil annexed around 55,000 square miles of Paraguay, and the Brazilian-backed Colorados retained control in Uruguay. Due to internal fighting between Argentina and Brazil, the Allies were unable to carve up and distribute the Paraguayan territories between them. Instead, Brazil was not allowed any lands it had not seized before the war. Paraguay was occupied until 1876, but in 1878, U.S. President Rutherford B. Hayes ruled in favor of Paraguay in a border dispute, forcing Argentina to cede its claim to territory in the Chaco. However, after the occupying forces left, Paraguay was left in the hands of corrupt politicians who were only interested in their own ambitions. The war left a huge mark on the collective consciousness of the Paraguayan people. After the war, huge tracts of publicly owned land were sold to pay the country's war debts, which led to the creation of large farming estates at the expense of small-scale and indigenous farmers. This inequality is still seen today, with 85% of the agricultural land owned by just 2.5% of the population. Around 14% of this land is held by Brazilian farmers, who still wield massive amounts of political and economic power. Another effect that is still deeply felt is the inequality between the sexes. The war saw the deaths of around 90% of Paraguay's male population, meaning that the task of rebuilding Paraguay fell to the women. At the same time, the surviving men were in a position of privilege. Many feel that the culture of women as the carers for men contributed to modern issues of gender violence that are common in the country today. Francisco Solano Lopez remains a divisive figure in Latin American history. Some see him as a delusional dictator whose own ambitions drove his country to ruins. And yet, some argue that it was his passion for independence that led him to strive for his country's freedom at all costs. However he is painted in history, his actions in taking his country to war had a devastating effect on Paraguay that is still felt over 150 years later. Do you have an opinion on Francisco Solano Lopez's actions in the Paraguayan War? Let us know in the comments below. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about the Paraguayan War, check out our book, The Paraguayan War, a captivating guide to a South American war called the War of the Triple Alliance between Paraguay and the allied countries of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.